Between 1977 and 1985, 10 volunteers assigned to St. Matthew's Chapel in rural Michigan stopped showing up for their scheduled duties. None left official notices of resignation. In each case, the absence was initially dismissed as routine turnover. Yet internal records reveal a systematic failure to follow up, report, or even document the events properly. As patterns began to surface, inquiries were discouraged and staff turnover intensified. What remained was a quiet chapel with a spotless reputation and a long history of missing names. St. Matthew's Chapel was known for its quiet upkeep, strict routines, and serene atmosphere. Situated outside the town limits of Melleridge, it had served for decades as both a spiritual and administrative hub for the surrounding Catholic community. Its sacristans, unpaid assistants responsible for preparing the liturgical elements, were mostly young men from nearby parishes, often recommended by clergy or invited by the rector. The chapel maintained a consistent public image, disciplined, immaculate, and above reproach. But its internal personnel records, stored in a locked ledger cabinet until a diocesan audit in 1991, told a different story. Over the course of 8 years, 10 sacristans assigned there had quietly vanished from the books. Shall we begin with Chapter 1, Part 1? The practice of rotating sacristans had long been justified as a means of encouraging broader engagement among parish youth. The diocese issued quiet support for short-term rotations, framing them as spiritual internships. A sacristan might remain for a year or two, then move on, usually citing college, family needs, or personal transitions. It was an efficient explanation. Few questioned the turnover, particularly when each departure was followed by a swift replacement, hand-picked and trained by Father Neil himself. Yet there was something unusual in the consistency with which these transitions were handled. Each replacement arrived within 2 weeks of the last known presence of their predecessor. No application forms survived for the new appointments. Diocesan reviewers noted this in 1991, describing the recruitment log as incomplete and non-standard. None of the appointments had been documented through the Office of Volunteer Coordination, despite that being standard policy by 1979. Parishioners who attended Mass regularly at St. Matthew's often had only vague recollections of the rotating sacristans. Their duties were largely behind the scenes, typically performed in the early morning or evening. It was a quiet routine, checking altar linens, restocking incense, logging communion supplies, polishing sacred vessels. Most sacristans worked alone. During a review of parish bulletins from that era, a peculiar pattern emerged. Between 1977 and 1985, the weekly bulletins included only sparse mentions of sacristan activity. A total of 4 names appeared during those years, each for no more than 2 consecutive months. The remainder of the bulletins used generic language. One notice from February 1983 read, "Gratitude to our volunteers for their faithful preparation of the altar." No names. No acknowledgements. In a region where church rolls were typically celebrated, this anonymity stood out. At nearby parishes, sacristans were often recognized at Easter or Christmas, thanked by name. Some were even photographed for parish newsletters. At St. Matthew's, however, records suggested an operational quietness. The chapel's year-end summaries submitted to the diocese were always brief and formal. No concerns were raised. No deviations reported. By 1982, St. Matthew's had earned recognition for its uninterrupted continuity of service. It was featured in a diocesan circular titled "Parishes Without Incident." In the same document, other parishes were asked to model their record-keeping after St. Matthew's. This ironic recommendation came just 3 years before the first audit would uncover the missing sacristan files. The 1991 auditors attempted to contact former sacristans from the chapel's logbook. Of the 15 names listed between 1975 and 1985, only 5 could be reached. 2 stated that they had never served in any parish capacity and believed their names were entered in error. One claimed to have trained at St. Matthew's, but never formally began duties. Only 2 confirmed full service, and both had left before 1977. The remaining 10 names, all entered in handwriting different from the rest of the log, were marked with vague end dates. Most lines read simply, "Service concluded." In several cases, The term transferred was used without reference to any destination parish. No forwarding addresses were on file. No resignation letters were archived. The audit flagged these anomalies, but diocesan leadership determined them to be non-critical inconsistencies. The final report, issued in 1992, stated that no further investigation would be pursued. The chapel's current staff had turned over completely since the early 80s, and no one claimed direct knowledge of the missing records. Still, some staff who joined the chapel in the late 80s recalled hearing indirect references to earlier turnover. One groundskeeper, hired in 1986, remembered finding boxes of vestments in the storage basement labeled with initials he didn't recognize. He was told to disregard them. Another maintenance worker mentioned that he had once opened a drawer in the sacristy cabinet containing multiple unused chapel keys, each tagged with names absent from the current directory. Over time, small informal accounts like these accumulated, but they were never formally recorded. At most, they were noted in staff memos with phrases such as "no action needed" or "per archival discretion." The chapel's grounds remained immaculate. Flower beds were tended weekly. Brass fixtures were regularly polished. The schedule of masses never changed. Parishioners who moved to Melleridge from other towns often commented on the chapel's quiet efficiency. There were no complaints, no scheduling issues, no budgetary gaps. Yet the personnel files, when eventually retrieved from diocesan storage, revealed an odd redundancy in supply orders. Between 1978 and 1984, St. Matthew's ordered twice the number of standard altar garments than any comparable parish in the region. When questioned, former rectory staff cited the chapel's historically high rotation of volunteers. The explanation sufficed. The matter was closed. Of the 10 sacristans whose names were flagged, all had been between the ages of 16 and 22 at the time of appointment. All were male. None had formal seminary affiliations. Their personal addresses, where listed, were drawn from outlying towns no longer accessible via diocesan contact logs. No correspondence with families appeared in the files. During the final months of the 1991 audit, one of the file cabinets at diocesan headquarters was found to contain sealed envelopes with no recipient names. The envelopes bore dates matching each of the 10 missing sacristans' appointment months. None had been opened. Upon inspection, each contained a signed form acknowledging voluntary service at St. Matthew's. The signatures varied in style and legibility. None of them were verified against independent records. The cabinet also included a typewritten letter from Father Neil, dated June 1985, addressed to the diocesan office, explaining the need for continued discretion in clerical staffing procedures. The letter did not reference specific names, but described the period as one of transition and sensitivity. The context was unclear. No further letters from Father Neil were found after that date. He remained in his position until retirement in 1989. Upon his departure, he was praised in the diocesan newsletter for 34 years of dedicated service marked by organizational excellence and liturgical discipline. St. Matthew's Chapel underwent minor renovations in 1990. The sacristy was updated, and its original cabinetry was replaced. Several documents found behind the old cabinet backing were briefly catalogued, then archived without public notice. Among them was a handwritten list of initials with numbers beside each entry. The list bore no date or signature. Its contents were stored in the diocesan historical file under the classification Unresolved Clerical Notes. To this day, no official explanation has been issued regarding the missing names. The chapel continues to operate under new leadership, maintaining its reputation for precision and calm. Its bulletin boards display updated rotas and sacristan schedules, all computerized. Yet the original ledger remains sealed in diocesan archives, its annotations still handwritten, its gaps never filled. In the years immediately following the last recorded sacristan entry in 1985, the diocesan office received a series of administrative requests from St. Matthew's that, in retrospect, deviated slightly from standard practice. None of them raised formal red flags at the time. They were processed, filed, and approved in sequence. But viewed together, they formed a progression of subtle shifts that pointed to internal adjustments rarely explained in writing. One such request, dated September 1986, asked for a waiver on the requirement for sacristan age minimums. The chapel sought permission to consider volunteers as young as 15, citing a decline in local applicants and increasing need for early vocational exposure. The letter made no mention of safety procedures, parental consent protocols, or supervision plans. The waiver was granted by the auxiliary office within 4 business days. A second request followed in January 1987, seeking exemption from the annual background review for returning volunteers. The letter emphasized the chapel's stable volunteer environment and claimed that unnecessary reviews could create administrative bottlenecks. The wording was notably formal, signed by interim rector Father Lang, who had taken over after Father Neil's retirement. Again, the exemption was granted without condition. By mid-1987, a new pattern had emerged. The chapel began submitting fewer monthly personnel reports, often skipping them altogether. This was attributed to a staff transition. The Office of Parish Oversight sent a courtesy reminder, but received no response. The matter was eventually dropped. Meanwhile, maintenance records showed an uptick in requests for duplicate key sets. Between August 1987 and April 1988, 4 separate orders were placed for altar room duplicates. No loss or theft was reported. Each order was justified by the phrase volunteer turnover. The names associated with the keys were listed as initials only. It was around this time that informal observations began surfacing from neighboring clergy. A visiting priest from the Diocesan Training Center in Lansing noted during a homily rotation that the chapel staff appeared unusually guarded about access to the rear sacristy corridor. He had requested to retrieve a liturgical item, but was redirected twice before being handed the item by a groundskeeper. He later recorded the event in his personal log, remarking on what he called unusual boundary protocols. The log was not reviewed until years later. Another indicator, equally understated, appeared in the Diocesan Insurance Review for 1988. The report listed St. Matthew's as a low-risk property with restricted interior access. A footnote added that key control has been effectively implemented. The insurance assessor had made only a brief visit, escorted by administrative staff, and had not toured the lower storage rooms. Within the chapel, few outside the administrative corps had regular access to the personnel ledger. After 1985, new sacristan names were no longer entered by hand. Instead, brief typewritten memos appeared sporadically in the chapel's internal bulletin board, announcing temporary appointments. These memos were collected once a month and filed in a binder marked rotations. Several of these rotation notices were missing names entirely. A typical entry from November 1987 read, "Altar prep, covered through 11:30, responsibilities confirmed." No individual was listed. Another, dated March 1988, simply read, "Weekday shifts reassigned." In a setting where records were otherwise thorough, these gaps raised quiet questions among newer staff. One of the few individuals to retain consistent access to the internal archives was Sister Carleen, who handled scheduling and administrative correspondence from 1982 until her reassignment in 1990. She maintained a series of weekly notebooks detailing task distribution, deliveries, and keyholder assignments. When interviewed during the 1991 audit, she recalled that several sacristans between 1979 and 1985 had been unusually transient, often leaving with no formal closure. She described instances where vestments were left unreturned, altar kits left half-assembled, and supply closets reorganized without notice. Her notes occasionally included margin comments like "follow-up needed" or "odd timing." When asked if she had ever reported these observations, she explained that she had been advised to direct any concerns to the rector alone. No further documentation supported whether that follow-up occurred. Outside the chapel, family members of former sacristans were rarely contacted. The Office of Parish Records had no centralized process for verifying volunteer continuity beyond the scope of active service. Once a sacristan failed to appear for more than 2 weeks, it was assumed they had withdrawn. Parishioners were not informed unless duties were publicly disrupted. At St. Matthew's, such disruptions never occurred. Yet one exception did surface. In April 1984, a letter was sent by a resident of nearby Grafton, addressed to the chapel. It inquired about the status of a young volunteer who had served briefly the prior fall. The letter asked whether he had relocated or been reassigned. The return address was noted, but no reply copy was found in diocesan archives. The original letter was filed under Community Inquiries and marked No Response Needed. In subsequent years, a quiet trend developed among parishes in the surrounding counties. They began adopting a system of volunteer verification slips, requesting signed confirmations for any transfers or service completions. This was not a formal diocesan policy, but an informal safeguard. St. Matthew's never adopted the practice. When pressed during the audit, the chapel's new rector explained that internal methods were sufficient for local circumstances. He emphasized the chapel's history of minimal disruption and its long-standing reputation. No disciplinary measures were issued. Among the 10 flagged sacristan records from 1977 to 1985, at least 4 had overlapping dates. That is, they were scheduled to serve during the same month as others, despite standard practice allowing for only one active sacristan at a time. In 2 cases, the dates overlapped by more than 3 weeks. The audit team noted this as a probable clerical error. No effort was made to reconcile the overlaps with physical attendance logs, which had not been retained. A final layer of irregularity involved the chapel's supply vendor receipts. While most parishes used standardized requisition forms, St. Matthew's submitted handwritten lists through courier delivery. These lists were copied into vendor logs, then discarded. According to a former supplier in Grinnell, the chapel often ordered materials in pairs, such as duplicate incense vessels or matching linens, even when only one set was needed. He recalled asking once whether they were serving multiple chapels. He was told no. As years passed, these details accumulated quietly, never quite breaching the threshold of formal inquiry. The impression remained one of minor inconsistencies, explained away by high standards, operational transitions, or administrative burden. But beneath the polished surface, the pattern was already complete. Records had not disappeared by accident. They had never been fully created. Names had not been lost in transition. They had simply been entered, acknowledged, and then folded into a system that recorded only what was needed to preserve function, not truth. During a diocesan records review in 1993, unrelated to the original audit, an archivist noticed a notation in the supply registry referencing a restricted-use key cabinet installed at St. Matthew's in late 1982. The entry included a serial number, vendor invoice, and handwritten note reading authorized access rector only. No subsequent documentation confirmed who had accessed the cabinet or when. The cabinet itself was never inventoried. When diocesan maintenance staff visited the chapel in 1994 for routine electrical inspections, they found the cabinet still mounted in the sacristy corridor, locked and partially painted over. It had no visible keyhole, only a combination dial. According to a chapel groundskeeper, it had not been opened in anyone's memory. No directive was issued to inspect further. The inspection report marked the item as non-functional. The deeper significance of these observations was obscured by time and by the lack of formal incident reports. Personnel rotation and incomplete archiving left many timelines imprecise. But what emerged clearly was a pattern of deferred action. At each opportunity for inquiry, the matter was either deemed too minor, too ambiguous, or outside jurisdiction. Among the few documents that had remained untouched since their original placement was a set of visitor logs kept in the rectory guest room. These notebooks recorded occasional overnight stays, mostly by traveling clergy or diocesan auditors. Entries were sporadic and informal. In late October 1983, one such entry was found to contain a single name with no departure date recorded. The name matched one of the sacristans flagged in the original audit. No further annotations followed. This same sacristan had been referenced in a newsletter draft, written but never distributed. The draft, preserved in a communications folder, announced a farewell event scheduled for early November of that year. The newsletter was never finalized. No alternate edition was produced. The chapel's bulletin for that week made no mention of any staff changes. Other documents showed evidence of quiet cancellations. An appointment with a diocesan youth coordinator, scheduled for May 1985 to interview sacristan candidates, was called off by phone with no explanation. The coordinator later noted in her personal calendar, "Rescheduled, never confirmed." She made no further attempts to visit. In reviewing archived correspondence, analysts discovered 3 thank-you letters addressed to unnamed sacristans, written in nearly identical language, each dated months apart, between 1980 and 1984. The letters praised diligence and quiet devotion, but none included a specific name or mention of length of service. The envelopes were never mailed. By the late 1980s, references to sacristan roles at St. Matthew's declined even further. The chapel's official submissions to the diocesan annual review included only generic summaries. The 1988 report stated, "Volunteer liturgical support remains consistent." In 1989, the phrasing was simplified to, "Altar preparations remain uninterrupted." No individuals were named. When the Diocesan Review Board convened in 1995 to assess historical record-keeping across all rural parishes, St. Matthew's was included in a subset flagged for low personnel turnover yet frequent administrative waivers. The board's summary cited the chapel as unusual inconsistency and recommended a courtesy visit. That visit, conducted in June 1995, was led by 2 assistant auditors. Their notes described the chapel as remarkably preserved, with minimal deviation from historical operations. One auditor remarked on the absence of clutter, noting that the file cabinets appeared unusually sparse for a parish of that age. When asked about previous staff logs, the chapel's administrative assistant explained that most records from before 1990 had been sent to central archives. In truth, only a fraction of those records had ever arrived. Many were missing entirely, including shift logs, storage inventory sheets, and old appointment forms. The transfer manifests listed only the number of boxes shipped, not their contents. No index of the original collection had been created. In 1996, during a routine diocesan consolidation of historical materials, a mislabeled envelope was discovered among correspondence files. The envelope contained 4 photographs. Each showed a different angle of the chapel's sacristy, taken sometime in the early 80s. A handwritten label on the back of one image read, "For placement record." All 4 photographs showed an identical layout except for a single object, visible in the third image. A wooden bench against the far wall with initials carved into the side. The bench was not present in the other 3 images. None of the initials matched known staff. The photographs had not been filed under facility maintenance or design. Subtle inconsistencies like these continued to surface. A contractor's invoice from 1981 listed a short-term carpentry project labeled only rear shelving install. A staff memo from the same week mentioned restricted access due to archival rearrangement. No shelving units from that period were found in the current configuration. When diocesan researchers began cross-referencing chapel floor plans from different decades, they noticed slight discrepancies in the sacristy dimensions. A blueprint from 1964 listed the room length at 22 feet. A renovation diagram from 1990 listed 19 feet. No records explained the difference. The renovation report made no mention of wall adjustments. Despite these findings, no formal investigation was launched. The prevailing view within diocesan administration remained that any anomalies were likely due to clerical error, undocumented renovations, or natural staff attrition. The historical value of the chapel and its reputation within the community continued to outweigh procedural gaps. Among former volunteers who had served briefly in the early 90s, none recalled ever meeting anyone who claimed to have trained under the earlier system. Most described being shown routines by rectory staff, with little mention of previous sacristans. One former volunteer recalled asking about a stack of unused altar garments labeled with older names. He was told they were left from an earlier era. In rare cases when names of the earlier sacristans were mentioned, they were framed in past tense, without context. Phrases like, "He was helpful back then," or "One of the earlier ones before your time," were common. No stories, no personal details, just vague acknowledgements that someone at some point had been there. By the late 1990s, diocesan storage facilities began digitizing old ledgers. In the process, a small number of original index cards surfaced from a mislabeled box. Each card listed a volunteer name, start date, and a short phrase describing assigned duties. 10 of the cards bore dates aligning with the flagged period from 1977 to 1985. Each of those 10 cards was stamped with the word complete. No exit dates, no signatures. The remaining volunteer cards from other parishes included detailed notes, contact numbers, and follow-up summaries. The contrast in documentation was striking. Yet once again, the discovery was noted as archival irregularity. No follow-up was assigned. As of 1999, the chapel continued to operate under a newly appointed rector. The previous 2 administrators had since moved to administrative posts within the diocese. Neither had responded to interview requests regarding the sacristan records. The final summary of diocesan archiving efforts included a brief mention of St. Matthew's under a section titled Incomplete Files Attributed to Historical Loss. The conclusion was accepted without objection, and with that, the last formal effort to clarify the chapel's personnel record history was quietly closed. The first documented attempt to question the chapel's volunteer records came not from within the diocese, but from a graduate researcher affiliated with a small theological college in Lansing. In 2003, while assembling a thesis on rural parish administration during the 1980s, she contacted several former volunteers listed in diocesan personnel summaries. Her approach was routine: verify names, confirm years of service, and compile a profile of role evolution across parishes. When she attempted to verify the names associated with St. Matthew's Chapel between 1977 and 1985, she encountered a pattern that did not align with any other rural parish. Out of the 10 names logged for that period, only 2 could be matched to any known diocesan file beyond the original service cards. Of those, neither individual could be located. One had no forwarding address. The other's parish of origin no longer existed. Curious about the administrative gaps, she contacted the Diocesan Office of Parish Support. Her request was forwarded twice and eventually redirected to archival services. There, a staff assistant provided a brief response, stating that the chapel had undergone an unusual administrative simplification process during the 1980s, resulting in minimal retention of service-related documentation. The term was unfamiliar. When she asked for clarification, no further explanation was offered. Undeterred, she visited St. Matthew's in person. The chapel had changed little since the late 1980s. The grounds were tidy, the rectory plain and quiet. After attending a midweek liturgy, she introduced herself to the current administrator and inquired about historical volunteer data. He was courteous but brief. Most of the old records, he explained, had been transferred years earlier. Nothing from the 1980s was kept on site. She asked about prior sacristans. He mentioned a few names from the recent past, but showed no recognition of those she had listed. When pressed, he referred her to the diocesan archive again. He offered no further detail. Back at the archive, she submitted a formal records request for all documentation involving sacristan assignments at the chapel during the specified years. After several weeks, she received a compact file containing scanned copies of already known cards, the sealed envelopes from the audit, and 5 personnel memos with redacted contact information. The response letter noted that no additional documentation could be located at this time. Within her compiled notes, she highlighted a phrase that appeared multiple times across different sources: service concluded. This language appeared in personnel logs, internal memos, and rotation binders. Nowhere was it accompanied by a reason, form, or narrative. Other parishes used terms like resigned, transferred, or deceased. St. Matthew's alone used the ambiguous term without exception. Intrigued, she revisited the visitor logs preserved in the archive. There, she located the 1983 entry lacking a departure date. She traced the name to a high school yearbook from a town 20 miles east of Melleridge. The individual had graduated in 1982. She contacted the school, then the listed emergency contact. The number had been disconnected for over a decade. Her thesis shifted focus. What began as a study in rural parish roles was now becoming an exploration of administrative silences. She contacted two former diocesan auditors, both retired, who had participated in the 1991 review. One declined to comment, citing confidentiality. The other recalled that the chapel's records did not meet modern continuity standards, but said the concern never escalated. She submitted a letter of inquiry to the regional seminary asking whether any of the sacristan names had applied for formal training. The registrar confirmed that none of the 10 had enrolled. In a follow-up phone call, he added that it was unusual for that many volunteers to disappear from clerical pathways entirely. He encouraged her to consider that many rural volunteers came from itinerant families, and that turnover alone was not suspicious. Still, she pursued one last channel, a request to review insurance files associated with chapel operations in the early 1980s. These records, stored in microfiche at the diocesan legal office, were highly restricted. She submitted an academic appeal. After 3 months, she was granted conditional access to policy summaries. Within the summaries, she found a line item dated November 1984. The entry was part of an internal risk assessment. It read, "Review of on-site volunteer coordination procedures indicates irregular oversight, suggest supplemental incident log." No such log was found in diocesan archives. When she submitted a query asking for a copy, the reply stated that no document under that name had been retained. The phrase appeared in only that one entry. No associated claims, incidents, or corrective actions were listed. She concluded her research without publishing the original thesis. Instead, she submitted an internal report to the college archives summarizing her findings. The report noted that St. Matthew's had maintained a model of volunteer silence and procedural compression inconsistent with other parishes during the same period. No further academic reviews were conducted on the chapel in the years that followed. Elsewhere, however, a new development began to form. A retired maintenance technician from the Diocesan Facilities Department reached out to an archivist after viewing an internal training video that referenced key access logs. He remembered having installed a locking mechanism at St. Matthew's sometime around 1982 or 1983. At the time, the work order simply described it as Restricted Access Panel, Sacristy Corridor. He recalled that the request had come directly from Father Neil. No secondary approvals had been necessary. When asked to describe the work, he explained that the installation required minor alterations to the inner wall, including removal of a wooden panel and reinforcement with a steel bracket frame. He remembered the request as unusual, mostly due to its secrecy. He had not been allowed to complete the final seal. A member of the chapel staff had insisted on finishing the installation privately. His testimony was recorded but not verified. The chapel's current configuration showed no trace of such a panel. No blueprints referenced it. The maintenance logbook from that year included the request, but no diagram or closure note. Other former staff began to mention similarly minor details. One recalled a shift in storage arrangements during the mid-80s. A delivery shelf once used for vestment boxes had been removed without explanation. Another noted that several key tags from the old drawer had never been reissued. A third, formerly responsible for rectory deliveries, remembered a set of packages marked volunteer kits that had been collected without signature. The diocese, when contacted with these accounts, responded by issuing a short statement. All chapel operations during the relevant period were subject to internal review. No discrepancies requiring corrective action were found. The archivist, now in semi-retirement, kept a private log of all such testimonies. Over time, the entries grew into a loose timeline of off-the-record observations. Each pointed to routine elements adjusted slightly. Access, storage, naming conventions, record formats. None of them proved wrongdoing. None pointed directly to any policy violation. But together, they indicated a sustained approach to minimizing traceable detail. The sacramental schedules from the same period revealed no errors. The liturgical calendar remained unbroken. Attendance logs showed no gaps. What had been lost, if anything, was not in the function of the chapel but in its memory. In the fall of 2005, a diocesan-led renovation program aimed at restoring several aging chapels across Michigan included St. Matthew's on its priority list. Though structurally sound, the chapel had not undergone any significant upgrades since 1990. The program's funding covered interior updates, including archival room expansions and improved storage compliance. Contractors hired for the restoration included a regional firm based in Coldwater, which assigned a 3-person team to the project. According to daily work logs, the crew began with the main sanctuary and then moved to the sacristy. Work progressed without issue until the team reached the rear corridor connecting to the vestment room. There, during the removal of outdated paneling and electrical conduit, a concealed junction box was discovered behind a plaster overlay. It contained wiring that led to no visible outlet, switch, or light source. The wiring terminated in a sealed cavity, walled over and insulated. The cavity measured approximately 3 feet wide and 2 feet deep. The site supervisor documented the find and submitted a report to the Diocesan Facilities Office. The cavity, while unusual, did not violate code. The office responded with a directive to continue work without demolition beyond scheduled plans. The structure was photographed, re-insulated, and left sealed. A digital copy of the image reached the diocesan archive later that year. The image showed a smooth cavity with a narrow indentation along the base. A tag with faded ink was affixed to one interior wall, though the writing was illegible. It was noted, catalogued, and filed under non-functional structural elements. Over the next several weeks, small construction notes were added to the project file. One crew member remarked that the sacristy appeared more partitioned than necessary. Another noted the presence of a ventilation duct leading to no vent. The duct terminated behind a locked panel above the storage cupboard. The panel had no latch. It was painted to match the wall. No action was taken. The renovation remained on schedule. The project concluded in early 2006. A closing report described the chapel as fully compliant, updated, and structurally unremarkable. Elsewhere, at the Diocesan Records Office, a volunteer tasked with digitizing microfiche encountered a batch of internal memos from 1981 marked Sacristan revisions. Most consisted of routine rotation plans and altar linen inventories. But one memo labeled non-disclosure list caught her attention. It contained only initials, 10 sets, each followed by a 3-digit number. No explanation accompanied the list. The memo bore no signature, and no distribution record was attached. She flagged the document for supervisory review. The archivist reviewed the initials and cross-referenced them with known sacristan records. The 10 entries matched the same names previously marked with "Service concluded" in the personnel files. The numbers did not correspond to dates, payroll codes, or volunteer IDs. The memo was copied, refiled, and quietly appended to the audit record from 1991. No public statement was made. That same year, an independent researcher preparing a retrospective on diocesan staffing changes submitted a request to access non-digitized staff correspondence. In the process, he was granted access to an auxiliary ledger maintained by an administrative assistant between 1982 and 1987. The ledger contained notes on volunteer onboarding procedures, key distribution, and rectory scheduling. In the margin of one page, dated April 1984, a brief comment read, "Last intake under original method. No further additions per directive." The directive referenced no authority, no date, and no file code. Beneath the comment, a single word had been crossed out and rewritten 3 times. The final version read, "Archived." Around the same period, a former altar server who had trained briefly at St. Matthew's in 1986 contacted the Office of Historical Records seeking confirmation of service for a seminary application. He submitted a list of dates and requested copies of shift confirmations. The Records Office found only a partial attendance log, listing him by initials. The record confirmed training sessions and minor liturgical duties, but showed no formal assignment date. He later stated in his application that his time at the chapel had been brief and that staff transitions were occurring during that period. Separately, he described once being asked to complete a weekday setup in the main sanctuary alone, When he arrived, he found that the usual preparation had already been completed. The sacristy door was closed, the lights were off, and the linen cart was already restocked. No one else was scheduled. When he mentioned this to the chapel's groundskeeper, he was told, "Sometimes things are handled early." He never raised the issue again. Years later, he would recall that moment as minor but inconsistent. It was the only time in his training that the routine deviated. In 2008, the diocesan office implemented a final digitization sweep. Files from all parishes were reviewed for missing personnel documents, historical references, and inconsistent transfer logs. St. Matthew's submission included a letter from the current rector explaining that older paper records had been fully transferred or archived and that no further personnel files prior to 1990 existed on site. The digitization team flagged the chapel's data profile as closed historical loop. No additional information was requested. At the conclusion of the process, the database entry for St. Matthew's listed 15 sacristans for the period between 1975 and 1985. 10 were labeled unconfirmed. Each was tagged with the designation Service Archived, No Contact. No cause or note appeared in their digital record. The entries contained no attached files. The audit field marked Closure Method was left blank. In the final weeks of the digitization program, a technician scanning ledger sheets noticed faint imprints beneath one sheet from the 1983 personnel log. Using contrast filters, he isolated the markings, 3 sets of initials followed by calendar months, and the word cleared. The document had been typed, but the indentations suggested handwriting underneath. The handwriting did not match any known staff signatures from that year. The initials corresponded to names previously flagged in the audit. He reported the finding. The scan was saved, filed, and attached to the chapel's digital profile with the note, "Historical trace incomplete." It remains the last recorded update to that file. By 2010, St. Matthew's Chapel had undergone yet another administrative transition. The rector appointed that year was known primarily for procedural clarity and record restoration. He had previously served as a compliance officer for a diocesan training center, and his reassignment to Melleridge was seen internally as a means to re-establish uniformity in one of the system's most quietly persistent anomalies. His first act was to request a full review of the chapel's active and archived files, not in search of missing documentation, but to organize material in compliance with new diocesan digital standards. He authorized the retrieval of all storage cabinets from the rectory's second floor, including 2 units that had not been opened in over a decade. The review was slow and methodical. Among the contents were routine items: hymnals from the 1970s, service pamphlets, duplicate ledgers, and a series of undated correspondence drafts. But one box, labeled Rotations, contained something unexpected. It held 15 sealed envelopes, all unaddressed, all stamped with a date from between 1977 and 1985. Each envelope contained a 1-page document printed on chapel letterhead listing a volunteer's name and a 3-month period. All documents were signed, not by a rector, but by a clerical assistant whose name no longer appeared in any diocesan employment logs. Each document ended with a single sentence: "Service concluded by internal determination." The rector submitted a report to the Diocesan Review Board. The board acknowledged receipt, confirmed the documents were duplicates of records already catalogued, and advised no further action. The original documents were filed at the Central Archive in Lansing under reference code 4MR85. Outside official channels, interest in St. Matthew's history had waned. Most public attention focused on parishes with open reform programs or known historical corrections. St. Matthew's, by contrast, presented no open cases, no public complaints, and no known controversies. Yet within a small circle of academic researchers focused on clerical data systems, the chapel remained a reference point for procedural opacity. In 2012, a panel on administrative anomalies cited the chapel as an example of process optimization without informational redundancy. The phrase drew quiet attention. One attendee, a doctoral candidate studying systems theory in religious institutions, submitted a formal request to conduct a case study on the chapel's archive. The request was denied. The response stated that historical documentation has been processed in accordance with retention guidelines and is not subject to external review. She redirected her efforts to nearby parishes that had shared staff with St. Matthew's during the 1980s. There she found minimal overlap. Unlike other parishes that regularly lent or received sacristans during seasonal shortages, St. Matthew's had no documented exchanges. Personnel remained either permanent staff or unnamed volunteers. In late 2013, she obtained an interview with a retired parish coordinator who had once served in the region. He remembered visiting the chapel twice, both times as part of diocesan scheduling reviews. When asked about its internal structure, he described it as tightly managed, unusually quiet, and always prepared. He recalled that the chapel rarely submitted volunteer evaluations. When pressed for documentation, the staff would provide clean summaries with no attached incident logs. He had never seen disciplinary forms, corrective memos, or volunteer disputes. It was as if things never went wrong there, he said. The researcher compiled her notes and published an internal paper titled Retention Through a Mission, Case Analysis of Minimalist Ecclesial Systems. The paper cited St. Matthew's as a case where silence, consistency, and procedural insulation resulted in a history with few markers of change. Back in Melleridge, the chapel continued its daily operations. The rectory had been repainted, the sacristy lighting updated, and the schedule of liturgies stabilized. Parish bulletins remained brief, with limited announcements and no volunteer names listed. A new generation of altar servers, trained through diocesan programs, rotated briefly through the chapel. None remained for more than 3 months. Their files were processed through a central database. All entries after 2000 were verifiable and up to date. Still, in the background, the name list from 1977 to 1985 persisted as an unresolved entry in diocesan archival indexes. The individuals were not classified as missing, absent, or transferred. They were listed under a category labeled closed under internal criteria. No explanation of that criteria had ever been published. In 2015, a separate diocesan initiative began to standardize volunteer retention records across all rural parishes. As part of the effort, historical training manuals were digitized. In the process, a manual dated 1981 from St. Matthew's was found to contain a handwritten insert. The insert listed instructions for key control, altar access, and shift turnover. One instruction, underlined twice, read, "No independent access after final rota unless confirmed by directive." No explanation followed. The handwriting was matched to an administrative assistant who had not appeared in any known employment summaries. The instruction was preserved in digital form, but omitted from the official training guide transcription. By 2016, the chapel's archive consisted entirely of digitized entries. All paper files were boxed, coded, and moved to long-term storage. The only physical trace of pre-1990 documentation remaining on site was a commemorative plaque listing all clergy who had served since the chapel's dedication. No mention of sacristans appeared anywhere in public space. A visiting scholar from Indiana, writing a book on regional religious architecture, photographed the chapel and made brief inquiries about its staff history. He was told that all records prior to 1990 were stored off-site. When asked about the sacristy's earlier configuration, he was shown renovation diagrams dated 1990 and 2006. He later wrote that the chapel represented a model of administrative continuity, nearly immune to disruption or revision. In 2017, the Diocesan Archive reclassified several of its oldest files, including the sacristan records from St. Matthew's. They were marked as archival reference only, no further modification. The label was accompanied by a note indicating that the records had been reviewed, preserved, and deemed historically complete. No further annotations were added. No appeals were received. The entry remains unchanged. In early 2018, an internal memo circulated within the Diocesan Communications Office requesting assistance in producing a centennial history booklet for St. Matthew's Chapel. The project was intended as a public commemoration of the chapel's longevity and quiet service record. A research assistant was assigned to gather materials from existing archives. The assistant, unfamiliar with the chapel's historical gaps, compiled what was available: architectural diagrams, clergy profiles, mass attendance trends, and scanned bulletins. When attempting to fill the section titled Volunteer Legacy, she found no approved photographs, interviews, or named acknowledgements from before 1990. She contacted the diocesan archive to inquire about supplemental materials. The request was received and routed through standard channels. After 2 weeks, she was provided with a summary list titled Volunteer Classifications by Role. The list included only clerical support and altar guild members from the last 3 decades. Sacristan roles prior to 1990 were not included. When she followed up, asking whether such records had ever existed, the response stated, "Historical assignments from 1975 to 1985 have been reviewed, concluded, and are no longer in active reference rotation." The booklet was published later that year without the Volunteer Legacy section. A single paragraph noted that St. Matthew's has been supported by generations of unnamed volunteers whose quiet dedication has helped maintain the sanctuary's integrity. Among the parishioners, few remarked on the omission. Most attending services in 2018 had not lived in Melleridge during the chapel's earlier decades. The narrative of efficiency and continuity had remained undisturbed. That same year, a regional training course for new diocesan archivists used St. Matthew's as a case study in minimalist record compliance. A senior instructor outlined the chapel's internal practices as valid within older standards, though unlikely to pass under current audit expectations. The case study focused on how early administrative decisions could shape long-term public perception. While no violation had been recorded, the example served to highlight the limitations of silent record-keeping when personnel turnover was frequent. In response to the training session, one participant noted privately that the situation at St. Matthew's seemed more like procedural obscurity than actual historical absence. The comment was not included in the session report. Over the next 2 years, the chapel hosted several traveling clergy for seasonal liturgies. None commented on the record system. The sacristy remained functional, clean, and consistent in layout. Volunteer names continued to be excluded from bulletins. Roster entries were processed digitally and expired without ceremony. In late 2020, a diocesan archivist conducting a routine shelf review encountered a folder marked Suspended Entries, Restricted. Inside were 3 printed pages, each containing only names and dates. The header on the first sheet read, Unspecified Conclusion, Internal. The names aligned with sacristans from the flagged period. Each entry included an appointment date and a notation of 3 to 6 months, followed by no further detail. The sheets bore no signature, letterhead, or date of origin. The archivist brought the folder to the supervisor, who reviewed it briefly and placed it in the reclassification queue. It was indexed, coded, and stored under Non-Standard Personnel Summary. Access was limited to internal staff. By 2021, diocesan policy updates required that all entries flagged as incomplete or closed without explanation be marked for limited inquiry, barring a formal request. St. Matthew's records remained in this category. Meanwhile, a seminary student researching local parish histories contacted the diocesan office to request background on pre-1990 sacristan development at rural chapels. He was directed to standard orientation materials, which included only post-1995 case examples. When he asked specifically about St. Matthew's, the reply was short. Pre-1990 sacristan development at that location was not documented under current standards. He moved on to other parishes. His final paper excluded the chapel entirely. By 2022, the administrative system housing legacy volunteer entries underwent consolidation. Entries labeled Concluded, Internal were moved to a reserved partition. This segment of the database was preserved for compliance but excluded from future training access. A maintenance log from the same year showed a repair to the chapel's sacristy floor, which had begun to warp near the storage base. Workers replaced paneling and resealed the linoleum. Beneath the subfloor, they noted a series of wooden support pieces labeled in faded red marker. Each bore a single letter and number combination. The markings did not match known inventory codes or structural references. They were photographed and sent to diocesan maintenance. No interpretation was given. The site was restored and work completed within 2 days. Later that year, during a compliance update, a new rector arrived at St. Matthew's. He had not been briefed on the chapel's archival anomalies. When asked during a clerical interview if he had noticed any unusual record-keeping, he replied that all files appeared in order. In 2023, a digital exhibit on diocesan history briefly mentioned St. Matthew's as one of the most stable chapels by attendance record. It cited the absence of incident reports, administrative turnover, or policy breaches over 5 decades. The entry received no comments. It was viewed 16 times. As of 2024, the archival category, closed under internal criteria, had not been revised. The original names associated with the 1977 to 1985 appointments remained visible only through legacy indexes. No direct descendants had requested records. No inquiries had been made. The chapel continued its schedule, submitting monthly summaries with no deviations. Each year during Easter and Advent, bulletin inserts thanked unnamed volunteers for quietly supporting the sanctuary's rhythm. No further audits were scheduled. No further documents were located. If this story impacted you, if you stayed until the end, it's because you feel these hidden truths also need to be exposed. So leave in the comments the city you're watching from. This way we can see how far these stories are reaching. And subscribe to the channel. There are many other cases the world tried to forget, but we insist on remembering. This story is fictional. All names have been edited to protect the source. This video is for entertainment purposes only. But here's a disclaimer. It's based on historical facts.